Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how to apply listening in the classroom. So, first of all, keep in mind that students' needs should always drive your curriculum. So always keep your students' needs in mind. So let's think about a couple examples. First, think about a student who wants to be accepted into a U.S. university. What kinds of listening activities would you bring in to help them get into a U.S. university? So think by yourself for a few minutes. So my suggestion here is one, the student will need a lot of communicative skills. They might have to go through an admissions interview. They will also need to be able to listen to peers talking in study groups and in the dormitory, but they will also need a lot of academic listening skills, especially if they're listening to lectures from professors. So you would need to balance both of those. So a question for you. What listening activities specifically would you bring into class to meet this goal? So think for a few minutes on your own and write down a few notes. You might want to pause the video while you do this. So my suggestions for what to bring into the class. One, maybe a mock lecture from a professor, maybe something from YouTube or an actual lecture taped from a professor's classroom. Number two, you might want to check for understanding when working with a peer, because many students will need to work in group activities and study groups. Number three, practice listening to something nonfiction, perhaps a documentary or some other clip that you find that would help students listen for academic language. Number four, use strategies for clarification when a peer or professor is unclear. So for example, can you please repeat that phrase? Or I didn't catch that last thing you just said. Students will need to have some of these phrases as backups. Let's think of another example. A student wants to communicate with coworkers and clients in their job. So the student will primarily need a lot of communicative language, perhaps not so much of the academic language. So my question for you is, what specific activities would you bring into class to meet this student's needs? So pause the tape and write down a few notes that you could bring to the classroom. My suggestions, one, a mock dialogue that is recorded. So you could use a clip off of YouTube or perhaps from a movie of two people interacting. And what would be especially helpful is two people interacting in an office setting. Number two, use a similar dialogue from some other source that might not be from an office, but at least shows people interacting. Number three, have a written out dialogue that students can read to each other and practice. And finally, use similar strategies for clarification so that students know how to ask the partner to clarify in listening. This module is on speaking. So we will first talk about types of speaking and then how to integrate speaking more into the classroom. So first, thinking about speaking, it can be communicative speaking practice or academic speaking practice. So it's always important to keep your students' needs in mind. For communicative needs, they need to practice a lot, just having everyday conversations, perhaps what they would need in a grocery store or on the telephone. Academic speaking, though, would be a lot more involved in giving speeches and other tasks that would prepare them for university or a job. So let's talk about in the classroom. First of all, think of students' needs, because this will determine which kinds of tasks you will need to bring to class. Also, with assessment, first, think about, is it authentic assessment? Is this actually something they will be doing once they're done with your course? Is it integrated with instruction? So that means basically, is this activity something that flows naturally into your lesson plan, not necessarily something that happens later after class? So the example that I'd like to talk about is the information gap. So the information gap is when one partner has a certain amount of information and the second partner has different information. So they need to communicate to each other in order to reach the intended goal. The example that I thought of that you might want to adapt someday for your classroom is to give student A a starting point on a map and a destination, but they don't have the map. So student B has the map. Student A needs to ask questions to student B in order to find their way on the map, how to get to their destination. So this would be a good activity that's authentic because they will need to ask for directions at some point, and it's also integrated into the classroom activities. So in terms of assessment, you can assess this by listening as they're doing the activity and making notes to yourself on improvements, and you can also have the students assess themselves. They can be thinking about what they need to work on and what would have been more helpful in the activity.